Last time we spoke about the modernization efforts of Big Brother and Little Brother, aka China and Japan. Both nations went through the process of modernization in vastly different ways. Japan began its Meiji Restoration, an incredible hyper-modernization process done to thwart colonization by Western powers. Yet, China was hampered by hardline conservatives like Empress Dowager Cixi, who sought to instead restore the Qing Dynasty's symbolic grandeur over technological innovations such as railways. China's greatest leaders like Zhou Zongtang, Zheng Guofan, and Li Hangzhang did all that they could to usher in some form of modernization. Li Hangzhang emerged as the champion of modernization efforts for China, but he kept butting heads with stubborn conservatives wishing instead to reclaim the Qing's former symbolic glory. It would not only be the conservatives in China he would have to face, for the empire of the rising sun was growing and forcing China into the shade. This episode is China, Japan, and the Hermit Kingdom. Welcome back to the Fall and Rise of China podcast. I'm your dutiful host, Craig Watson. But before we can begin, I just want to remind you all that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Perhaps you want to learn a bit more about the history of Asia? Kings and Generals has an assortment of episodes on the history of Asia and much, much more. So go give them a look over at YouTube. So please, subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube and continue to help us produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, don't forget about our sister podcast over at the Pacific War Week by Week podcast, written and narrated by me. And if after all that you are still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel over at YouTube, where I'm just now finishing up my multi-part series on China's warlord era. Also, just a friendly reminder, I now myself have a Patreon account, which can be found at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel, and I want to thank all of those of you who've already signed up. Over there, you can find exclusive podcasts directed towards subjects you want to hear more about that I can't cover over here or in other projects I'm associated with. So please, if you have a chance, check it out. It'll mean a lot to me. In the early 1860s, before Emperor Meiji took the throne, the Japanese sought to establish diplomatic relations with China. The Japanese regarded China as an enormous nation that could provide markets for their merchants, but more importantly, China could cooperate with Japan in the face of Western challenges. Who better to help thwart off the West than Big Brother? In October of 1870, the Japanese official, Date Munenari, went to Tianjin to meet Li Hangzhang to see if they could open formal diplomatic relations. Li Hangzhang believed in the value of establishing relations with Japan and the importance for China to modernize and self-strengthen. Li Hangzhang admired Japan for preventing Westerners from invading their nation and limiting the activities of Westerners from her borders. The meeting was a cordial one. Both sides saw a common interest in working together to resist the West. And I just want to take a little minute to express something. If you read sources about the history of China and Japan during this time period, the late 19th century, there is a lot of accusations made by certain historians about the intentions of Japan and when they emerge. Particularly in the People's Republic of China, there are those that accuse Japan of making a long-term plan to simply go to war with China. Most certainly, Japan eventually does plan to do this. But when this emerges, that is kind of the crux of this. A lot of these authors say it's right from the offset of the Bakumatsu period, and it's kind of ridiculous. I just want to point out my own opinion on the matter because, I guess I've specialized quite heavily in this time period. From everything that I have read, and this comes from multiple sources, from multiple nationalities, so it's not just even China and Japan, there are other actors who are, foreign advisors and such looking into the matter. It seems that Japan really did believe in what they were saying to China initially. Take, for example, later on in history, I'll be talking about it a bit, with Ito Hirobumi and Li Hangzhang. During their initial conversations, there was mutual cooperation, and it was very real. Japan really did seek China's aid in trying to thwart Western colonization efforts against their countries. However, as we are going to see, there are multiple events that weakened China's hand. And alongside other things that are going on, Japan, who was like any other nation, an opportunistic nation, saw a door open to basically abusing China. What Japan ends up doing to China at the end half of the 19th century is pretty disgusting. But what I'm trying to say is it wasn't pre-planned from the very offset. If you read certain books from Chinese authors, they'll say this goes back to like the 1600s, with the invasions prior. It's pretty ludicrous. Anyways, I'd like you just to keep that in mind as we carry on this rather tragic story. In 1871, on September the 13th, Li Hangzhang and Date Mananari signed the Friendship and Trade Treaty, the first diplomatic document between Japan and China in modern history. Li Hangzhang agreed that the two nations would not launch aggressive actions against another, and that if either nation were involved in a conflict with an outside power, the other one would come to their assistance. It sounded a lot like Pan-Asia unity, well, at least on its way. But before the treaty could be ratified, the Japanese tried to eliminate the clause to provide assistance and added a new clause, that Japan would be given most favored nation status, thus giving Japan the same rights that the Western nations had forced upon China. Yes, it was an unequal treaty clause. As you can imagine, Li Hangzhang was greatly annoyed by this, and he delayed the ratification to try and get the Japanese to back down. By May of 1873, the Japanese yielded, accepting the Mutual Assistance Clause and abandoned the Most Favored Nation Clause. Leaders of China and Japan then expressed that their nations shared common culture and were a common race. Dongwen Dongzu, Dobun Dosu. And thus they shared an interest in working together to respond to the threat of the West. When this treaty was signed, the Iroquois mission had not yet returned to Japan, but Emperor Meiji had assigned Japan's foreign minister, Soima Taniomi, to go to China to learn about her position on the issues of the Ryukyu Islands and Taiwan. Japan had interest in them, and knew this would lead to conflict with the Qing Dynasty. Soima was an expert on Chinese classics and skilled at Chinese poetry. Thus, when he went over and the Chinese host began to make it clear Japan was in a supplicant relationship with China because she held the Chinese emperor, Soima used his knowledge to wedge Japan into a special position. He came to Tianjin and met with Li Hangzhang. Famously, when they met, Li Hangzhang was in his traditional clothing, while Soima was in Western attire, and Li Hangzhang criticized him for this. Soima then went to Beijing and waited several days trying to get an audience with the high-level Qing officials. The Qing were greatly angered by the Japanese attempt to get the most favored nation status in their treaty. Thus, they really were trying to hammer it in that Japan was a supplicant to China. Soima was upset at the condescension from which he was treated. He quoted the Duke of Zhou, stating to the Qing, "If you treat foreigners as barbarians, they will be just that. But if you treat them as true gentlemen, they will indeed become true gentlemen." Soima was the first Japanese person in modern times to meet the Qing emperor. Prince Gong greeted him and told Soima he would not have to kowtow before the emperor. The kowtow issue had actually been resolved because Western diplomats had made too many problems of it. By proxy, Japan would not have to either. The Qing made an effort to show respect to Soima by seeing him before any other foreign diplomats and allowed him to bow just 3 times. Soima was wined and dined by Li Hangzhang in Tianjin later, and it was extremely cordial. And there was really goodwill between the men. Soima's experience in China had him returning to Japan confident that China would not stop Japan from expanding her trading activities in the Ryukyu Islands. Japan then prepared a legation staff to China and established a formal diplomatic office in Beijing with Mori Aranori as its ambassador. Li Hangzhang advocated that Beijing should establish a legation in Japan, arguing that if China had had a legation there, they could have prevented Japan from attacking Taiwan in 1874. China's legation staff would arrive to Tokyo in December of 1877. Again, very slow to the mark. Li Hangzhang was cautious about Japanese attentions now and in 1876 when he met with Mori Aranori. They shared concerns over Russian advances, and Li Hangzhang suggested to Mori Aranori that their nations should cooperate on matters involving Korea. At this time, Japan was focusing efforts to strengthen its northern island against possible Russian threats. They viewed Sakhalin, Manchuria, and Korea to be regions of national security concern. While Japan worried about Russia encroaching on Hokkaido from the sea, China worried about Russia encroaching on its northeastern region. Although the Trans-Siberian Railway only began construction in 1891, their efforts to settle people across Siberia in preparation for its construction began much earlier. The Qing had not allowed non-Manchu people to reside in their homeland of Manchuria since the conquering of the Ming Dynasty centuries before. To strengthen the resistance against Russia, in 1878 the Qing changed this immigration policy to allow and even encourage non-Manchu to come to Manchuria. Within a few years, many migrants came from various parts of China to settle in Manchuria. Japan likewise was sending settlers to develop Hokkaido. But unlike Japan, the Qing had no real developmental plans to modernize Manchuria. Soon after Hokkaido began being developed, the Japanese next move was to gain control over the Ryukyu Islands, south of Japan's four main islands. This would be the first real tension between Japan and China. From 1862 to the mid-1870s, Japan had concentrated on defense, and thus things revolved around her four main islands. After the mid-1870s, however, Japan gained in strength and began to expand her defensive perimeter. The Ryukyu, were known in Chinese as the Liuchuai Kingdom, was led by indigenous peoples who oversaw the small islands stretching between Kyushu and Taiwan. The Ryukyu Kingdom tried to fight for its independence by showing goodwill to both China and Japan, and this brought the Qing and the Tokugawa presence. The Ryukyu Kingdom maintained Chinese and Japanese emissaries who came regularly, but never at the same time. The Ryukyu Kingdom paid tribute to China and traded with her, thus was influenced heavily by her. However, culturally the Ryukyu were closer to Japan, and Satsuma domain in particular, who had a large influence on her. From 1871 to 1874, Japan used a shipwreck incident involving some Ryukyu fishermen off the coast of Taiwan to strengthen her rights to govern the Ryukyu Islands. In 1871, Ryukyu fishermen in 4 small boats got stuck in a typhoon, sinking 1, shipwrecking 2, and leaving 1 afloat. The survivors made their way ashore on Taiwan, where 44 of them were killed by Taiwanese aboriginals. 12 fishermen survived, and they escaped aboard their last boat back to the Ryukyus. At this time, Taiwan was under the control of Fujian province, and the Japanese government demanded China compensate the fishermen. This was also inherently the Japanese government claiming the Ryukyu Islands belonged to them. For 2 years, the issue went unresolved, and in 1874, Japan launched a punitive expedition led by Taigo Tsugemuchi, the brother of the famous last samurai, Taigo Sakamori. And if you happen to be interested in the story of the last samurai and Taigo Sakamori, well, you can go over to my personal channel, the Pacific War Channel, where I have an episode dedicated to the Satsuma Rebellion. And I also did a review of the film The Last Samurai. And that film is a bit of a mix between 2 events, the Boshin War and the Satsuma Rebellion. It's honestly an amazing movie. It's not very historically accurate, of course, but it, I'll give it this. It gives a good feeling of the times. But back to the story. The Qing officials explained to the Japanese that the Taiwanese were not technically under Qing control, and that the Ryukyu Islands were actually under Qing jurisdiction. The Japanese expeditionary forces remained on Taiwan, intentionally to intimidate China. Sojima and the official Okubo Toshimichi went to China to discuss the issue, and under pretty severe pressure, the Qing officials agreed to pay a compensation to Japan for the Ryukyu sailors, but later stated that they were unaware the payment would also provide Japan with support for her own claim over the Ryukyu Islands. Li Hangzhang was livid over this betrayal, and he stated that while the Europeans were at least honest in their negotiations, the Japanese were duplicitous. By the mid-1870s, the Japanese and Chinese militaries both increased their presence in the Ryukyu Islands. Then in 1879, during the process of abolishing the old feudal domains to replace them with prefectures, Japan officially recognized the Ryukyu Islands as the prefecture we know today as Okinawa. Japan followed this up by ordering Okinawa to stop sending tribute to China. Now, Li Hangzhang had supported relations with Japan, even with their incursions against Taiwan in 1874. and their swindle of the treaty deals. But in 1880, China refused Japan's official proposal concerning the Ryukyus. China, however, did not follow this up militarily, which would be a mistake. The problems between China and Japan would only worsen, and it would be Korea stuck in the middle. Japan's interests in Korea were both for security and economic. Of all the territories near Japan, Korea was the most significant strategic area. Korea was in a vortex of Russia, China, and Japan. Korea had also been the crux of two military clashes between Japan and China in 661 to 663 and 1592 to 1598. Alongside that, Korea had been the staging area for failed Mongol invasions of Japan in 1274 and 1281. A German military advisor to Japan, Major Jacob Meckel, stated that Korea was, quote, a dagger thrust at the heart of Japan. That quote would have a profound effect on Japanese strategists henceforth. Japan was concerned other nations like Russia would use Korea as a base from which to attack her. Yet, if Japan could establish a military presence on the peninsula, well, that might prevent anything like that from ever occurring. Historically, Japan had dealt with Korea, better called the Qing Dynasty, through the Tsushima Islands and the Busan Island. Both Korea and Japan took up isolationist policies, and much like how Nagasaki acted as Japan's only open port for so long, Korea kept Busan as its only open port. During the Sakoku period, Japan gave the Tsushima domain the responsibility of dealing with Korea specifically. There had always been limited trade between the two nations, but things certainly changed after Japan kicked off its Meiji Restoration. Japan had looked to nations like Britain as an example of how to build a strong economy. This led Japanese officials to seek a relationship like Britain had when it came to economic activity, to manufacture products, sell it to its colonies, and build up its own economy. Their idea for this was to import soybeans and wheat from Korea and sell Korea industrial products. Initially, Japan's only major export was raw silk, so they decided to try and export silk textiles. In late 1869, a Japanese representative from Tsushima was sent to Busan to announce Japan was to have a new emperor. Standard stuff? What was not standard, however, was in the letter sent to the Koreans, the term for the Japanese emperor used the ko character rather than taikun. The ko character was used to refer to the Qing emperor, implying the Joseon dynasty's emperor was inferior to him. By using the ko character for the Japanese emperor, Japan was trying to establish that very same relationship. So just to further explain a bit, the reason why the Koreans would go through with this, which is a tributary relationship, is by showcasing that the Qing emperor is so grand, he in turn legitimizes the emperor of your nation. And once the tributary status is a thing, your nation does get some benefits, trade benefits, as well as protection. So in essence, what Japan was doing was trying to make this relationship for themselves with Korea as well, which, as you can imagine, would deeply get Korea in trouble with China. And so the Korean officials refused to receive the new representative, and the mission failed as a result. The Koreans wanted to remain in the Sinocentric world as tributaries to the Qing. This fiasco led to the legendary Seikanron debates, in which Saigo Takamori argued Japan should perform a punitive expedition against Korea. And again, if you want to hear about this rather hilarious tale, which is part of the Satsuma Rebellion, please go check it out on my personal channel. It's honestly one of my better episodes, and it's very entertaining. But long story short, the Japanese leadership knew that they were not yet strong enough to embark on such a venture, so they blocked Saigo's motion. Now, Japan did not simply give up on the Korean situation. They kept trying to send envoys to force Korea to recognize the equality between Japan and China. In the meantime, in 1875, the steam gunboat Unyo, under the command of Inoue Yoshika, was dispatched to survey the Korean coastal waters. On the morning of September the 20th, Inoue put ashore a party on the island of Ganghwa to request water and provisions, and here came a major conflict. Ganghwa had quite recently been the place of two major conflicts. One, a French expedition against Korea that occurred in 1871, and another was an American expedition that very year. Thus, the men manning the fortifications at Ganghwa were, quote-unquote, trigger-happy to say the least, and they have fresh memories of what foreign ships could do to them. When the Japanese came ashore, the Korean shore batteries began firing upon the Unyo. The Japanese, as you might imagine, were really pissed off, and they quickly dispatched 32 men, consisting of 10 Marines, 19 sailors, and 3 officers to attack the Gojong fort. The men landed near the eastern gate of the fortress, and immediately white-coated Joseon defenders began firing their antiquated matchlocks and some arrows down upon the Japanese. A Japanese sailor was wounded by a matchlock ball, and another was hit in the groin by an arrow. The Japanese pressed their attack, climbing over the wall to open the gates as the Marines rushed into the fort. Likewise, the Unyo fired its 6.3-inch and 5-inch deck guns to support the assault. The Koreans tried to flee through their western gate only to run into 6 Japanese sailors who ambushed them. Kawamura Kwanshu, a Japanese officer present that day, had this to say about the event. They clambered down the steep bank on the southeastern side, and in hopes of escaping to the opposite island, they stripped off their clothes and plunged into the sea. Unfortunately, the tide was high and too deep to wade across. Many of them hesitated, and we fired on them without mercy. 24 Koreans were killed on the rocks, and many more drowned trying to swim to safety. Only 6 or 7 were able to make it safely ashore on the distant island. The commander of the fort, Yi Ming-duk, managed to escape as the Japanese plundered the fort, which Kawamura further on tells us, "We took 36 bronze cannons and a drum nearly 6 feet in diameter. In addition to this, there were 4 drums 3 feet in diameter. Their trumpets were very like toy trumpets used by children in Japan. Their bows also were very like Japanese. Their arrows were exactly like those from Japan. The swords were numerous, but they must have been bought in Japan. The guns were all matchlocks. Among the booty was a French book on gunnery, translated into Chinese." Many Koreans were captured, and they were forced to carry the plunder to the Unyo as the rising sun flag was raised over the fort. The Japanese held the island awaiting a challenge from Korea, but none came. The next day, the Unyo returned to Japan, leaving Gojong in ruins. The entire ordeal turned into an implicit threat to Korea. If they refused to recognize Japanese claims and open up relations with Japan, she might use military might. Within Japan, the Korean incidents had just gone hand in hand with the Satsuma Rebellion of 1877 to push the Japanese public more so towards supporting military action in Korea. The Meiji leadership was under pressure, but they had hoped to avoid conflict by resolving such problems through diplomacy. Li Hangjiang perceived that if Japan were to invade Korea, this might provoke Russia to respond, and thus China also wanted to resolve such issues through diplomacy. The Qing Dynasty officially held suzerainty over the Joseon Dynasty. Thus, they held the right to approve Korea's foreign policy decisions, but not to interfere with her domestic affairs. For centuries, China held this right, but they did not exercise it. Then in 1875, Mori Adenori was sent to Beijing to seek Qing support to open up trades between Japan and Korea. Mori Adenori met with the Qing Office for General Management of Affairs concerning the various countries, which is a mouthful, known more simply as Zhongli Yamen. The Zhongli Yamen official stated while Korea was a Chinese dependency, China still could not interfere with her domestic affairs, and thus could not demand she open up trade with Japan. So the next year, Mori Adenori met with Li Hangjiang over the issue, and both men sought a peaceful agreement. Mori Adenori advocated for Korea to be treated under international law as a sovereign state. Now, Ito Hirobumi, the rising political leader of Japan during this time, believed progress could not be made opening Korea up by working with the Qing. He urged his colleagues that Japan should work with Korea directly instead. Korea at this time was going through some major changes as well. The young emperor Gojong turned 21 years of age in 1873, and he replaced his father, Yi Haiyung, who was the Hungsin Daewongun, basically the regent ruling the dynasty. His father was an extreme conservative, with very simple foreign policies, which were summed up by the American historian Bruce Cummings as this: no treaties, no trade, no Catholics, no West, and no Japan. Pretty straightforward policies. Yes, the Daewongun liked his isolationist policy, and he was not wrong about doing it. By keeping Korea as bottled up as possible, he was able to keep Western powers arguably out of the situation for quite some time. However, the problem with this was while keeping the West out, you were also hindering chances at modernization and an industrial revolution. Korea was known as the Hermit Kingdom, and while she tried to do her best to keep the world out, the world eventually would come crashing in. When Gojong came to power in 1873, unlike his father, he was much more willing to consider opening up and working with the Japanese. Now, alongside Gojong was his wife, the famous Empress Min, also called Empress Min. She was born to the Yaohuang Min clan in 1851. They were a noble clan who historically held a high position in the Joseon dynasty. She had lost her father at the age of 7, and she was raised by her mother and other Min relatives. When Gojong turned 15, his father sought a wife for him. He wanted someone with no close relatives, so she could not harbor much political ambitions, but still came from a noble lineage. Not to get too much into details, but the way that the Korean royal family worked, the wife's family and her in-laws hold considerable power within the court. So the father here was trying to find someone who wouldn't be able to, well, outvote him, so to say. No, he rejected many until he found the orphaned Min, who was beautiful and of ordinary level of education. She was married to Gojong, and then afterwards, the Daewongun realized the empress held political ambitions. Daewongun had this to say of her: she was a woman of great determination and poise. Despite this, he paid little mind to her, and things moved on. However, Empress Min would soon ruffle some feathers. She showed herself to be very assertive and ambitious. She did not toss lavish parties for the nobles, nor did she participate in the normal extravagant lifestyle. You know, the wine and dining, tea parties with the princes and princesses, all that jazz you see in the show The Crown. No, instead, she spent a lot of her time self-educating, reading books reserved strictly for men. She studied history, science, politics, all the works. By the age of 20, she began trying to play an active role in politics, in spite of the Daewongun and other officials trying to stop her. And then she bore a child prematurely, who died 4 days after birth. This prompted the Daewongun to state publicly that she probably was unable to bear healthy male children, which became quite a public scandal. Queen Min even suspected her father-in-law had slipped her something like ginseng into her tea perhaps, and that this caused pregnancy issues, which is really psychotic. I mean, if this guy really did that, whoa. The Daewongun proceeded to push his son to conceive a child through a concubine called Yi Guiyin, and she soon gave birth to Prince Wanhua. Daewongun quickly tossed the title of Crown Prince upon the child, and it looked like the jig was up for Empress Min. However, Empress Min secretly began to form a powerful faction against the Daewongun. The faction included high officials, scholars, members of the Min clan, and they made a move to remove the Daewongun from power. Empress Min's adoptive older brother, Min Sung-ho, along with the Joseon court scholar, Cheo Ik-hyun, formally impeached the Daewongun, arguing that Gojong, then the age of 22, should rule in his own right. The royal council agreed to this, and the Daewongun was forced to retire. The second he was out of the picture, Empress Min banished Yi Guanyin and her child to a village outside the capital and stripped them of the royal titles. The child also died on January the 12th of 1880. And yes, if you're asking yourself, did Empress Min have something to do with this? There are accusations, to say the least. Now, Empress Min had control over the Joseon court and quickly appointed trusted family members in high court positions to assert her dominant role as queen consort. Again, to the point I made earlier, the female side of the family in the Korean royal family structure at this time actually tends to have a lot of power, even that over the king. And Empress Min was quite the firebrand of a woman. She's a very interesting character, and I do apologize for my knowledge of Korean history is quite limited, but I do recommend if you are into this sort of stuff, there are actually Korean TV series, but I guess you would really call them soap operas, that cover the life of various figures like Empress Min. There's actually also a movie, I think from 2001, that covers her as well. Now, just a few months after the Unyo incident, Japan sent an emissary to Korea to push for a treaty. It was the exact same type of situation Japan faced when Commodore Matthew Perry's black ships showed up to Japan. It was gunboat diplomacy. King Gojong signed what became known as the Gangwon Treaty, and this opened up 3 Korean ports to Japan. One at Busan right away, one at Busan in 1880, and the other at Incheon in 1883. The treaty was an unequal treaty, very much in the same light as the ones forced upon Japan by Western nations. The treaty had ended the Joseon dynasty's tributary status under the Qing Dynasty. Now she was to be seen as an independent state. The Chinese were now suspecting Japan sought a presence on the peninsula, and Li Hangzhang openly expressed fears that Japan might develop territorial ambitions on the mainland. The Chinese and Japanese continued to talk about cooperation against the West, especially against Russia, but they were also quite wary of another now. Now, Korea was not idle during all of this, and her officials sought a way to secure her. King Gojong sent a mission to Japan headed by Kim Hong-jip. Kim Hong-jip was presented a plan by a Chinese diplomat named Huang Zhixian, who called for a strategy for Korea. He warned that if Korea was threatened by an empire like Russia, Korea should maintain friendly relations with Japan and China, and seek an alliance perhaps with the United States to counterweight Russia. Kim reported this to King Gojong, and he was impressed by the plan. Then in 1880, following the Chinese advice, King Gojong established diplomatic ties with the United States. Negotiations began between all the nations in Tianjin, and the Treaty of Peace, Amity, Commerce, and Navigation was signed by Korea and the United States. However, during the negotiations, issues did rise up. The Chinese insisted that Korea was not independent, and still a dependency of China. America firmly opposed such a thing, stating the new treaty should be built upon the Treaty of Gangwon, which stipulated Korea was an independent state. A compromise was made between China and the United States, stipulating that Korea held a special status as a tributary state of China. Now, as of 1879, China had given Li Hangzhang responsibility for relations with Korea. Li Hangzhang urged Korean officials to adopt China's self-strengthening program to do the same for their nation in response to foreign threats. Korea, after all, had just opened herself up to the world and now would pursue modernization under a doctrine known as Dongdosogi, Eastern Wars and Western Machines. To modernize, Korea would incorporate Western technology while trying to preserve her culture. It was much akin to the Meiji Restoration. In 1881, Korea established the Tangni Kimu-amyun Office for Extraordinary Affairs, modeled on the Qing administrative structures. That same year, a mission was sent to Japan to see their modernized factories, military, and education system. Korea then hired a Japanese military attaché, Lieutenant Horimoto Reizo, to help create a modern army for Korea. This led to the Pyeongjigun, Special Skills Force, which were around 100 men of Korea's aristocracy that were given Japanese military training. And thus now, Korea had firmly put herself between China and Japan, who would begin fighting over her. I would like to take this time to remind all of you that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Please go subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube and continue to help us produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, don't forget about our sister podcast over at the Pacific War Week by Week podcast, written and narrated by me. And if after all that you are still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel over at YouTube, where, as I had mentioned, I have an episode on the Satsuma Rebellion and some historical film reviews like that of The Last Samurai. And just a friendly reminder, I myself have a Patreon account now, which can be found at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel. And I just want to say a big thank you to all of those of you who've already joined up. I had quite a surge recently, and I'm soon going to open up some polls to see what you guys want to hear more about for some exclusive podcasts. So if that's of interest to any of you, please go check out my Patreon. It'd mean a lot to me. Trouble was brewing between the Qing Dynasty and the Empire of the Rising Sun. It seemed the Hermit Kingdom of Korea was a continuous source of conflict for the two empires, and perhaps it might drag them into a war that would change the balance of power in Asia forever.